Clara slammed the deed down on Cornelius Hargrove's desk so hard the inkwell jumped. "Read it," she said. "Out loud. The lien entry. August 1876. Read it to me word for word, and then tell me why that exact language does not appear anywhere on the original instrument I was handed at my aunt's death." The room went silent. Two clerks froze at their desks. Hargrove's smile stayed in place the way a mask stays in place, held there by intention, not by feeling. He looked at the deed. He looked at Clara. And in the space between those two looks, she understood exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly, "I think you should sit down. I think you should answer the question. Before we go any further, please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. Drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." The silence in the land office stretched another 3 seconds before Hargrove stood. He was bigger standing than sitting. Clara registered that without stepping back. He came around the desk slowly the way a man moves when he wants you to feel the space closing, and he picked up her deed between 2 fingers, like it was something mildly distasteful, and set it back on her side of the desk. "You've had a long journey," he said. "You're tired. You're grieving your aunt. These are understandable conditions that can cause a person to see discrepancies that aren't there." "I'm not tired, I'm not grieving, and the discrepancy is there." Clara tapped the document. $412. Harlan Creek Agricultural Lending Association. August 14th, 1876. That entry does not exist on the original deed. I want the loan agreement that generated this lien. I want the notary record. I want the original filing stamp. Those records are archived. Where? It would take several weeks. Where are they archived, Mr. Hargrove? In this building or at the territorial office in Denver? The smile finally moved, not disappeared, shifted, into something that was still polite and had nothing warm left in it at all. "Miss Whitmore." His voice dropped. The clerks had gone very still. "I have been County Land Commissioner for 7 years. I have managed the records of 4,300 property holdings in this county without a single successful challenge to my office. What you are suggesting, what you are implying, is an accusation that carries serious consequences for the person making it." He paused. "I would think very carefully before you take another step in this direction." Clara picked up her deed. She folded it along its original creases. She put it in the leather pouch. She looked at Cornelius Hargrove for one long moment and memorized his face the way she memorized numbers completely and permanently. "Thank you for your time," she said, and walked out. The heat of the street hit her, and she kept walking. Not fast. Fast would look like running. She walked at the pace of a woman who knew exactly where she was going, turned the first corner. She reached, stepped into the gap between 2 buildings, and put her back against the wall. 5 seconds. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way her father had taught her at 14, when a man twice her age had told her she had no business reading the contract in front of her. 5 seconds. Then she started thinking. The lien was fabricated. She wasn't guessing, she knew the way she knew when a balance sheet had been altered 3 entries back, even when the totals still came out clean. The date, the amount, the creditor name. She needed the original loan filing. She needed to know if that lending association was a legal entity at all. And she needed to know whether her aunt's property was the only one. She came out from between the buildings and walked toward the laundry. The woman in the doorway had been watching her since she'd come out of the land office. Heavy-set arms, built by years of real work eyes that missed nothing. She had a laundry basket on her hip, and the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time for something she couldn't name. "Ruth Dodd," the woman said. "You're Delia's niece." "Clara Whitmore." "I know. Come inside." Ruth poured coffee without asking, and sat across from Clara and said, "What did he show you?" "A lien I've never seen before. $412. Harlan Creek Agricultural Lending Association." Ruth set her cup down. Her hands, Clara noticed, were very steady. The steadiness of someone who had already done all their falling apart in private. Harold signed a paper 3 years ago, Ruth said. He thought it was a lease renewal. He couldn't read well. When he died, I went to the land office, and Hargrove showed me a loan agreement Harold had supposedly signed, handing over water rights to the east pasture as collateral. She looked at Clara straight. We never borrowed money from anyone in our lives. Did you dispute it? Lawyer in town told me I'd need the original instrument to challenge it, and Hargrove held the original. Said without it, I had nothing. Ruth's jaw set. I lost the pasture 18 months ago. Same creditor called the debt. I couldn't pay what I never owed. The Harlan Creek Agricultural Lending Association. Same one. Clara opened her notebook. How many other families have you heard of with similar problems? 4 that I know about. Garrity east of town lost 60 acres. McCaffrey widow on the North Road nearly lost her house before her son raised the money to pay a debt she swore she never incurred. 2 others I can name. Ruth leaned forward. I've been trying to tell people for 3 years that something is wrong. Nobody wanted to hear it. A widow complaining about paperwork she can't produce. Her voice was even. You know what they say. They say you don't understand what you signed. Every time. Show me everything you still have. Any document Harold brought home from that office. Any letter from the lending association. Any receipt, any correspondence, anything with a date or a signature. Ruth got up without a word and came back with a small tin box. Inside were 4 documents worn soft from handling. Clara spread them on the table and read each one in silence. Ruth watched her the way people watch a doctor reading test results, not wanting to ask, unable to look away. This receipt, Clara said. From the final payment demand. The notary seal on this is embossed, not stamped. What does that mean? It means it was made with a hand press, not an official stamp. Official county instruments use a registration stamp that leaves ink. An embossed seal can be made by anyone with $40 and a trip to a printer in Denver. Clara set the receipt down and picked up the loan agreement. And this signature line, the witness signature, is above the notary line, not below it. In every valid instrument I've read in 10 years, the notary certifies after the witnesses. The sequence here is reversed. Ruth stared at the paper. You can see that. My father was a property attorney. He taught me to read instruments before I could read anything else. Clara turned the loan agreement over, held it up to the light from the window. And this paper, feel the weight of it. Ruth took it, felt it between her fingers. It's lighter than the others. Because it's newer. The other documents in this box are 7-8 years old. The paper has settled, darkened slightly at the edges. This one was printed recently and aged artificially. You can see it if you know what paper does over time. Clara set it down. Ruth, this document is a forgery. A good one, but a forgery. The kitchen went quiet. Ruth sat very still with her hands flat on the table and her face doing something complicated and private that Clara gave her a moment to finish. Harold knew something was wrong, Ruth said finally. He told me the week before he died that he thought he'd made a mistake with that paper. He couldn't explain what kind. He just knew. She looked up. Can you prove it? Not yet, but I think your husband's property isn't the only one. I think your aunt's isn't the only one either. Clara turned to a fresh page in the notebook. Tell me everything you know about those other 4 families. Every detail. And then I need you to take me to them. They spent 2 hours on it. Clara wrote everything, dates, amounts, creditor names, property locations, the specific language each family remembered from the documents they'd been shown. She filled 4 pages. And then she turned to the back of the last page and drew a line. Give me the location of each affected property, she said. As precisely as you can. Ruth described them. Clara marked each one on her rough sketch. When she had all 6, including her aunt's land and Ruth's pasture, she set the pencil down and looked at what she'd drawn. "What is it?" Ruth asked. "What do you see?" "Look at the shape." Clara turned the page so Ruth could see. "These 6 parcels. They don't scatter randomly across the county. They form a line, northeast to southwest, roughly 4 miles wide and about 14 miles long." Ruth studied it. A line. A corridor. Clara's voice was quiet. "Ruth, do you know if there's been any discussion about a railroad route through this county?" The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Ruth's face changed, not with surprise, but with the expression of someone hearing out loud the thing they'd been unable to name. "There was talk," Ruth said slowly. "2 years ago. A surveyor came through, said he was doing geological work. Harold didn't think anything of it." She pressed her fingers against her mouth. "You think someone is buying up this corridor? Through fraud?" "I think someone is assembling a right-of-way and using fabricated debt instruments to force landowners off their property instead of paying fair market value for it." Clara folded the sketch and put it in the notebook. "Which means there's real money behind this. Railroad money. Which means Hargrove is not working alone." "Who else?" "I don't know yet. But whoever filed the original incorporation for that lending association, if it's filed at all, signed their name to something. And that name is in a record somewhere." Clara closed the notebook. "I need to go to the sheriff's office." Ruth's expression shifted. "Callahan. Is he honest?" "He's honest." A pause. "Whether he'll believe a woman who walked off a stagecoach this morning with a theory about the county land commissioner, that's a different question. Then I'll give him something harder to ignore than a theory." The sheriff's office was at the end of the Main Street door, open against the heat. The man behind the desk was reading a wanted circular with the focused stillness of someone who used concentration the way other men used walls. He looked up when she came in. His eyes were dark and direct, and they assessed her in one practiced sweep, not the way men looked at women, but the way a former investigator looked at anyone who walked through a door. She registered that and revised her approach slightly. "Help you, ma'am. I'd like to file a formal complaint against Cornelius Hargrove, County Land Commissioner." He set the circular down. Whatever he'd prepared for it wasn't that. "On what grounds?" "Document fraud. Fabrication of recorded liens against multiple land holdings in this county. And I believe it's connected to an effort to assemble a railroad corridor through false debt instruments." She came to the desk and laid her notebook open to the sketch. 6 properties. 1 corridor. Same creditor on every fraudulent instrument. Same reversed notary sequence on every forged agreement. Wade Callahan looked at the sketch. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "Cornelius Hargrove has held this office for 7 years. The territorial office has audited his records twice. Then either the auditors didn't know what to look for, or the irregularities were introduced after the audits." She kept her voice level. "I'm not asking you to arrest him. I'm asking you to open an investigation." "Based on what exactly? A sketch and a theory?" "Based on a lien that appears on the county copy of my deed, but not on my original instrument. Based on a loan agreement in Ruth Dodd's possession with a reversed notary sequence and paper stock that's less than 2 years old on a document supposedly dated 1875. Based on 4 other families with parallel discrepancies." She tapped the notebook. "And based on the fact that within 3 hours of me asking Hargrove for the original loan filing, he filed a complaint against me for reckless allegations." That landed. She saw it, a small, precise change in his expression. "How do you know about the complaint?" "Ruth Dodd told me your deputy came by. 3 hours, Sheriff. He didn't wait to see what I found. He moved to stop me before I found it." Callahan was quiet. He wasn't dismissing her, she could read that much. He was doing what careful men did, which was take a long time with something they couldn't immediately disprove. "What's your background, Miss Whitmore? You talk like an attorney." "Women can't be admitted to the bar in Pennsylvania." She said it the way she always said it, flat factual, without asking for sympathy. "But I did every piece of work an attorney does for 10 years in my father's property law practice, except sign my name to the filing." He looked at her for a moment. 10 years of property law. Yes. And you're telling me you can look at a deed and identify a fabricated lien? I'm telling you I already did, twice today. She held his gaze. I know you have no reason to trust my judgment yet, so I'll do what I said. I'll document every discrepancy I can find in this county, and I'll bring it back to you in a form that doesn't require you to take my word for anything. But I need to know that when I bring it back, you'll act on it. Wade Callahan picked up the wanted circular, set it down again, looked at the sketch one more time. You said Ruth Dodd has a document with a reverse notary sequence in her tin box at the laundry, and you can demonstrate the paper stock dating. Anyone who works with documents regularly can see it if they know what to look for. I can show you. Another silence. Then, come back tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Bring the Dodd document and your original deed. He picked up the circular again. I'm not opening an investigation on a sketch, Miss Whitmore, but I'll look at what you have. It wasn't yes. It wasn't the opposite of yes either. Clara recognized the difference. 8 o'clock, she said and left. She was halfway down the street when she heard him come out of the office behind her. She didn't turn around. Miss Whitmore? She stopped. Hargrove knows you're here. His voice was quiet, matter-of-fact. He knows you went to Ruth Dodd. He'll know by tomorrow who else you've talked to. A pause. This is a small town, and he has been its senior official for 7 years. I'm not telling you to stop. I'm telling you to be careful about what you leave in your room tonight and who you let know where you're staying. Clara turned. He was standing in the doorway with the late sun behind him, and his expression was the same careful neutral it had been since she'd walked in, except for something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not sympathy. More like the look of a man who had once moved too slowly and was deciding whether this was a situation that required him to move differently. You believe me, she said, not a question. I believe Hargrove filed a complaint in 3 hours, he said. That's all I'm saying. Clara looked at him for one moment. 8 o'clock, she said again. She walked back to the laundry. The street was quieting for the evening lanterns coming on in windows, the forge cooling horses being stabled. An ordinary end to an ordinary day in a small frontier town where 6 families had lost their land to a man who understood that the most effective way to steal from people was to do it in language they couldn't read. In her rented room above Ruth's laundry, Clara spread her notes across the desk and added everything she'd learned from the afternoon. The pattern was clear. The mechanism was identifiable. What she didn't have yet was the one document that would make it irrefutable, the original filing for the Harlan Creek Agricultural Lending Association, which would have a signatory, which would be either Hargrove himself or the person above him, and which was sitting somewhere in the territorial records in Denver, waiting for someone who knew what question to ask. She also didn't have proof of the railroad connection yet. That was a theory built on geometry. But theories built on geometry had a way of turning out to be correct. Clara blew out the lamp at midnight. In the dark, she could hear the town settling into sleep around her horses, when the distant bark of a dog. The ordinary sounds of a place that didn't yet know it was about to have something taken from it, exposed. Her hands had not shaken once today. She intended to keep it that way. She was at the sheriff's office at 7:55. Wade Callahan was already there. He had coffee on the stove and 2 cups on the desk, and the Dodd file she hadn't brought yet was the first thing he asked about when she came through the door. Ruth Dodd's document, he said. You said you'd bring it. I said I'd bring my original deed and the Dodd document. I have both. Clara set the leather pouch on the desk and pulled out her deed first, then the 2 items she'd taken from Ruth's tin box the night before the loan agreement, and the payment demand receipt. Start with the receipt. Hold it up to the light from that window. Callahan picked it up, held it, said nothing for a moment. Then, the seal. Embossed, not stamped. Official county instruments use a registration stamp that deposits ink. You can see it on the original deed right here. She laid her deed beside the receipt. This seal was made with a hand press. Anyone can order one from a printer in Denver for $40. He put the receipt down and picked up the loan agreement. Turned it over, turned it back. "Show me the notary sequence," Clara pointed. "Witness signatures here above the notary certification line. In every valid instrument recorded under territorial law, the notary certifies after the witnesses below the witness line. The sequence is reversed." Could be a clerical error. It could be. Except it's the same reversed sequence on 2 of the other 4 documents I reviewed yesterday. The same error on documents supposedly executed in different years by different parties. She kept her voice even. 3 identical clerical errors is not a pattern of carelessness. It's a pattern of copying. Callahan set the loan agreement down and looked at it without touching it, the way she'd noticed he looked at things he was taking seriously. He had the particular stillness of a man trained to think before he acted, which she appreciated more than she expected to. "You said yesterday you could demonstrate the paper dating," he said. "Feel the weight of the loan agreement. Then feel my original deed." He did. She watched his jaw tighten slightly. "The loan agreement is lighter," he said. "Newer stock. Paper from the early 70s has more rag content, heavier, slightly rough at the edges, and it darkens here." She indicated the corners of her deed. "This loan agreement was supposed to have been executed in 1875. The paper says otherwise." Wade stood up from the desk. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her for a moment, and Clara had enough experience reading people to know he wasn't dismissing what she'd said. He was doing the harder thing, which was accepting it. "If you're right," he said without turning around, "then Hargrove has been running this for years, right under this office. Under your predecessor's office too, most likely. He's been commissioner for 7 years. He turned. "And you think this connects to a railroad? I think the geometric pattern of the affected properties connects to a potential right-of-way. I can't prove the railroad connection yet. I need the original filing for the Harlan Creek Agricultural Lending Association. If it exists as a registered entity at all, the filing will be at the territorial office in Denver. And whoever signed that filing is either Hargrove himself or the person directing him. Denver's 4 days by stage. I know, which is why I'm hoping you have a faster way to query territorial records." She paused. "You were Pinkerton before you came here." The stillness that followed was different from his thinking silences, sharper. "Ruth Dodd told you that," he said. "She told me you were thorough, and you didn't move on incomplete information." Clara held his gaze. "She meant it as a compliment. I'm taking it as one." He looked at her for a long moment. "Pinkerton contacts don't work the way they used to once you leave the agency. But they exist. Some of them. I'm not asking you to call in favors you don't want to call. I'm asking you to open an official investigation that would give you legal standing to request the territorial records directly." She spread her 4 pages of notes on the desk. "I have 6 affected properties, documented discrepancies on 3 instruments, a pattern that any surveyor could confirm in a day, and a county official who filed a complaint against me within 3 hours of a single question he couldn't answer." She looked at him straight. "What would it take?" Wade Callahan came back to the desk. He sat down. He looked at her notes for a long time without speaking, turning pages, and Clara stood still and let him read. She'd learned long ago that the worst thing you could do when a careful man was deciding something was hurry him. Finally, he said, 2 years ago, a surveyor came through this county, said he was doing geological work for a mining concern out of Denver. Ruth mentioned him. He spent 3 weeks here. I talked to him twice, seemed legitimate, had the right paperwork, moved on." Callahan picked up her sketch. "I looked at the route he covered and I didn't see anything then. But I wasn't looking at it against this." He set the sketch down. "I still have the record of his visit. His name, the company he claimed to represent, the days he was in each area of the county. If the company is real, it's a mining concern. If it's not real, or if it changed its stated purpose between registration and that survey, Then you have evidence that the railroad right-of-way acquisition started before the first fraudulent instrument was recorded. Clara pulled her notebook closer. What was the company name? I'd have to pull the record. He stood. Wait here. He came back 4 minutes later with a ledger, found the entry, and read it aloud. Summit Range Geological Survey, incorporated in Colorado Territory, Denver, 1874. Clara wrote it down. I'll need someone to verify that incorporation at the territorial office and check whether Summit Range Geological Survey has any recorded relationship with a railroad company. She paused. And I'll need the same check done on the Harlan Creek Agricultural Lending Association. Miss Whitmore. He stopped. She looked at him. Before I open a formal investigation, which will be visible on record and which Hargrove will know about within 24 hours, I need to understand the full scope of what you're asking me to put this office behind. He leaned forward on the desk. If you're right, there's someone above Hargrove with enough capital to fund a railroad corridor acquisition. That kind of money buys influence beyond this county. If this goes wrong, if we move before the evidence is irrefutable, he walks, and every family you're trying to help loses their last chance to recover what was taken. His voice was even and careful and entirely serious. I've made the mistake of moving too fast before. I am not going to make it again. Clara heard what was under those words. Not reluctance. Precision. He wasn't asking her to slow down. He was asking her not to miss the shot. Then we don't move until it's irrefutable, she said. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Let me work. Give me access to whatever records in this county I'm legally entitled to examine as a property claimant. Let me build the case the way it needs to be built, document by document, instrument by instrument, until there's nothing left to argue about. She met his eyes. And then you move. Something settled in his expression. Not agreement exactly. The particular look of a man who had just recalibrated his understanding of the person in front of him. You can examine any public record in the land office as a claimant in a dispute, he said. Hargrove can't legally deny you access to registered instruments. If he tries, that itself becomes part of the record. I know. He'll know you're looking. He already knows. He filed that complaint. Clara closed her notebook. I'd rather he watch me work than not know I'm there. A man who knows he's being watched makes different mistakes than a man who thinks he's invisible. Callahan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, almost to himself, You've done this before. I've had practice, Clara said, and picked up her pouch. She went back to the land office at 9 o'clock. Hargrove wasn't there. One of the clerks, a young man named Peters, with the uncomfortable look of someone caught between two larger forces, told her the commissioner was out on county business and would return in the afternoon. Clara identified herself as a claimant in an active property dispute and stated her legal right to examine registered instruments pertaining to her claim. Peters looked at the door. Hargrove had gone out, looked at Clara, and then went to the filing cabinet without another word. She spent 4 hours in that office. Peters brought her 3 folders. She went through every instrument in each one, carefully taking notes in her small, precise hand, comparing dates and notary stamps and witness sequences and paperweights, with the systematic patience of a woman who had grown up understanding that the truth lived in the details no one else thought to check. By noon, she had found 2 more reversed notary sequences on instruments unrelated to her aunt's property. One on a lien filed against a homestead belonging to a family named Prescott, $187 same creditor, and one on a water rights transfer involving a parcel that sat directly in the center of her sketched corridor. She was copying the instrument numbers into her notebook when the door opened and Hargrove walked in. He stopped when he saw her. The mask went up smooth and immediate, but she'd been watching for it and she saw the half-second before it settled. Miss Whitmore. His voice was pleasant. I wasn't expecting you this morning. I'm exercising my right as a claimant to examine registered instruments pertaining to my dispute. She didn't look up from her notes. Mr. Peters has been very helpful. Hargrove looked at Peters. The young man found something urgent to do at his desk. Hargrove walked to the counter and placed both hands on it and looked at what Clara was writing. She turned the notebook slightly so he could see the instrument numbers she'd copied. "You've been busy," he said. "I have." She capped her pen. "I've been comparing notary sequences across instruments filed in the past 7 years. It's remarkable how consistent some of the errors are." A pause. "Clerical variations occur in any high-volume record office. Identical variations across unrelated instruments filed in different years involving different parties." Clara stood and gathered her papers. "You're right that clerical variations occur, Mr. Hargrove, but identical errors don't vary. That's what makes them identical." She picked up the folders and set them on the counter in front of him, neat and squared. "Thank you for maintaining such thorough records. They've been very illuminating." She walked out before he could speak again. She was 3 buildings down the street when she heard quick footsteps behind her and turned to find Peters the clerk slightly breathless, hat in hand. "Miss Whitmore." He glanced back toward the land office. "I only have a minute." Clara stopped. "Then talk fast. The Prescott family. The lien you found on their instrument this morning." He swallowed. "Mr. Prescott came in last spring trying to dispute it. Hargrove showed him the original filing and told him the debt was valid, and the only alternative to payment was forfeiture." Peter's voice dropped lower. "Mr. Prescott left the county 2 months later, sold the property for a quarter of its value to a land holding company out of Denver called Meridian Properties." "Meridian Properties," Clara repeated, writing it down. "There are 3 other transfers in the past 2 years where the buyer was Meridian. All properties with disputed liens. All sold well below value." He looked at the land office door again. "I don't know what you're doing, ma'am, but whatever it is, please, the Prescotts had 4 children." He turned and walked back before she could respond. Clara stood on the main street of Harlan Creek with Meridian Properties written in her notebook and felt the shape of the thing clarify in a way that sent a cold, precise understanding through her. Meridian Properties, a Denver holding company, buying distressed land from families driven off by fabricated debt at a fraction of market value in a corridor running northeast to southwest through a county where a geological survey had been conducted 2 years prior by a company that may or may not have had anything to do with mining. This wasn't a county official running a local graft scheme. This was a coordinated land acquisition operation backed by real capital, using a county official as its instrument designed to assemble a railroad right-of-way without paying fair price for a single acre of it. She was at the sheriff's office in 4 minutes. Callahan looked up when she came in, and something in her expression made him sit forward. "What happened?" "Meridian Properties." Clara put the notebook on his desk. "Denver Holding Company. Has purchased at least 4 properties in this county in the past 2 years, all from landowners with disputed liens, all significantly below market value. If they're the same entity behind Summit Range Geological Survey, then you have a direct chain from the survey that mapped the corridor to the company assembling it, running straight through Hargrove's office." She sat down across from him the first time she'd sat down in his office. "And one of your clerks just told me this at personal risk, which means he's been watching it happen and waiting for someone to ask the right question." Wade stood up. He paced once to the window and back, and Clara watched him process it, not with the flat, professional neutrality he'd worn all morning, but with something tighter underneath the look of a man who lived in a town and was just now calculating the full dimensions of what had been done to the people in it. "Peters told you this," he said. "He knows more than he's told me. He's frightened." "He should be. If Hargrove knows he talked—" Wade stopped. "I need to bring him in, formally as a witness where he's on record, and Hargrove can't touch him without making it worse for himself." "Agreed. But do it today, not tomorrow." Wade looked at her. "You think Hargrove will move against Peters?" "I think Hargrove filed a complaint against me in 3 hours. Peters has been in that office watching this for years." She held his gaze. "How long do you think it takes a man like that to identify a loose thread?" Something crossed his face, not alarm exactly. the colder, more purposeful thing that lives on the other side of alarm in a man who has trained himself to convert urgency into action. "I'll bring Peters in within the hour," he said. "There's something else." Clara turned to the instrument numbers in her notebook. "I need to verify that Meridian Properties and Summit Range Geological Survey are connected entities. I need the territorial incorporation records for both, and I need to know if either name appears in any railroad right-of-way filing for this region." She looked up. "You said your Pinkerton contacts were limited, but you have legal standing to request territorial records as part of an active investigation." "I have legal standing once I formally open one." "Then open it." He was quiet, not hesitating, the different, more deliberate quiet of a man deciding not the outcome, but the timing. "If I open it today," he said carefully, "Hargrove will know by tonight. He'll start moving records. He's already moving something. The complaint he filed yesterday was the first move." Clara closed the notebook. "Every day we wait is a day he has to clean up what he's built. We are not going to catch him by being slower than he is." Wade Callahan looked at her for a long moment. She noticed, not for the first time, that he didn't look away when he was thinking. Most men looked away. He looked straight at the thing he was considering, with the particular focused steadiness of someone who had learned, probably the hard way, that looking away was how you missed what mattered. "All right," he said. He pulled a form from his desk drawer, uncapped a pen, and began to write. Clara watched his hand move across the paper and felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter and more grounded than either. The particular feeling of two people who had come at a problem from different directions, finding without ceremony that they were standing in the same place. "Miss Whitmore," he said without looking up, "when I send to Denver for those incorporation records, and it will take at least a week for a response, you're going to need somewhere to stay that Hargrove can't easily access. Ruth Dodd's Laundry. Ruth's a good woman. She's also known for having talked to you." He finished writing, blotted the form, set it to the side. "There are 3 families in this county who have reason to want Hargrove stopped and the resources to keep a guest quietly. The Garrity's east of town. They lost 60 acres. They won't talk." Clara looked at him. "You're worried about my safety." "I'm worried about your evidence." He met her eyes. "You're the only person in this county who can read what you've found. If something happens to you or to your notes, we go back to nothing." It was a practical statement delivered practically, and Clara recognized it as such. She also recognized that a man who had been carefully neutral for the better part of 12 hours had just used the word "we" without appearing to notice he'd done it. "I'll speak to Ruth about the Garrity's," she said. "Do it before this evening." He stood, picked up his hat from the hook by the door, and put it on with the particular settled gesture of a man who had made up his mind. "I'm going to go find Peters before Hargrove gets to him first." He was out the door before she could answer. Clara sat alone in the sheriff's office for a moment in the quiet that followed. She looked at the open investigation form on his desk with Wade Callahan's signature at the bottom, in a hand that was direct and without flourish, and thought about how 12 hours ago she had walked into this office with a sketch and 4 pages of notes, and a man who had every professional reason to show her the door. She picked up her notebook and walked out into the afternoon. Hargrove was standing across the street. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and watched her come out of the sheriff's office, and the look on his face was the look of a man recalculating the cost of something he had already decided to do. Clara looked back at him. She held the look for 3 full seconds. Then she turned and walked toward the laundry, and she did not let herself check whether he was still watching. She knew he was. Ruth didn't argue about the Garrity's. She listened to Clara explain. It looked out the laundry window at the street for a moment, and then went to the back room and came out with a cloth bag already half packed. "I'll take you out there myself," Ruth said. "Thomas Garrity is a hard man, but he's a fair one, and his wife Margaret will feed you whether you want it or not." She paused at the door. "You should know they lost their east 60 acres 14 months ago. Thomas doesn't talk about it, but Margaret told me he hasn't slept a full night since. He blames himself for signing something he couldn't read clearly. He shouldn't, Clara said. No. But that's not how it works when a man loses land he's worked for 20 years. Ruth picked up the bag. You telling him it wasn't his fault won't fix that. Proving it wasn't his fault might. They rode out in Ruth's wagon in the late afternoon, the sun cutting low and hard across the flats. Clara kept her notebook on her knee and her leather pouch pressed against her side, and watched the road behind them twice without making it obvious. Nobody followed. That didn't mean nobody knew where she was going. Thomas Garrity met them at the gate with the closed-off expression of a man who had learned that visitors meant complications. He was perhaps 60, weathered past his age, with the particular permanent squint of someone who had spent decades reading the sky for weather. He looked at Clara the way men like him looked at strangers, not hostile, but reserving judgment the way a careful man reserves ammunition. Ruth, he said. Tom, this is Clara Whitmore. She needs a place to stay for a few days, and she's got something to show you and Margaret. He looked at Clara for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the gate. Margaret Garrity was everything Ruth had promised. A compact, precise woman who put coffee and cornbread on the table without ceremony, and sat down across from Clara with her hands folded and her eyes sharp. Thomas stood by the window. He didn't sit for the first 10 minutes. Clara put her notes on the table and talked. She didn't soften it or slow it down to make it easier to hear. She laid out the pattern, the instruments, the reversed notary sequences, the paper dating the corridor, Meridian Properties, the surveyor from 2 years ago, in the same direct sequential way she would have laid it out in a legal brief, because these were people who had been spoken to softly for a year and a half, and it hadn't given them their land back. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Thomas Garrity turned from the window. His face had done something complicated while she was talking. She'd watched it happen without looking directly at him, the way you watch something fragile that might break if you pay it too much attention. The paper I signed, he said. His voice was rough. The loan agreement. I told the lawyer in town that it didn't feel right. Something in the language wasn't what I'd agreed to. He told me I was misremembering. He stopped. I wasn't misremembering. No, Clara said. You weren't. Can you prove that? If I can get access to your copy of the instrument and compare it against the county record, I can demonstrate the discrepancies the same way I demonstrated them with the Dodd document this morning. She held his gaze. The sheriff opened a formal investigation today. He's bringing in one of the land office clerks as a witness. What I need from you is your documentation, anything you have from the transaction, and your permission to include your property in the formal complaint. Margaret Garrity looked at her husband. Thomas looked at Clara. Then he crossed to the sideboard, pulled open the bottom drawer, and took out a tin box identical to Ruth's. Everything's in there, he said. I've kept it all, every piece of paper. I didn't know why, just couldn't make myself throw it away. He set it on the table in front of Clara, and then he did sit down heavily like a man who had been standing against something for a long time and just been told he could stop. You tell us what you need. Clara worked at the Garrity table until the lamp burned low. The tin box held 4 documents: the loan agreement, 2 correspondence letters from the Harlan Creek Agricultural Lending Association, and a payment demand. The loan agreement had the reversed notary sequence. One of the correspondence letters was on paper stock lighter than it should have been for its stated date, but it was the payment demand that made Clara set down her pen and look at the document for a full 30 seconds without writing. The notary seal on the payment demand was embossed. She'd expected that. But the embossed seal was not the Larimer County official seal. It was close enough that someone not looking for the difference wouldn't find it. But the inner ring of the design was slightly different, and the Latin text around the border was missing one word. She had seen this seal before. Not in person. In a property fraud case her father had documented 12 years ago in Philadelphia, where a fraudulent notary seal had been used to legitimize a chain of fabricated liens. Her father had kept a sketch of that seal in his case notes. She had read those notes so many times she could see the sketch now without closing her eyes. The seals were not identical, but the method was. Whoever had made this seal had done it before somewhere else and had learned how close you could get to the real thing without triggering immediate detection. "Margaret," Clara said, "does the name Aldous Crane mean anything to you?" Margaret looked up from her mending. "No. Should it? I'm not certain yet." Clara wrote the name in her notebook. "It may mean nothing. I'll need to check a different record to know." She didn't explain further. She closed the tin box carefully and made a list of every document she'd need to borrow and returned everything else to Thomas with instructions on exactly how to store it. He listened to her with the focused attention of a man rebuilding his understanding of what had happened to him and making sure he didn't miss a word. "One more question," Clara said as she gathered her notes. "The 60 acres you lost, Meridian Properties bought them." "Quarter of their value," Thomas said. The flatness in his voice was worse than anger. "Did anyone from Meridian come to the property before the purchase to inspect it or assess it?" Thomas and Margaret exchanged a look. "A man came out about a week before the offer," Margaret said slowly. "Said he was a land assessor. Spent most of his time on the east boundary along the creek. Tom thought it was strange the best grazing was the west pasture, but he wasn't interested in that at all." "The east boundary," Clara said. "Along the creek." "Walked it twice. Took measurements." The east boundary of the Garrity property ran northeast to southwest along the creek bed. Clara knew this because she had been looking at property maps all afternoon. She knew without needing to check her sketch exactly where that creek ran in relation to the corridor she'd drawn, straight through the center of it. She was up before dawn the next morning and at the sheriff's office by first light. Wade Callahan was already there, which stopped being surprising after the second time it happened. He had a pot of coffee and a look on his face that told her Peters had given him more than either of them expected. "Talk," she said. "Peters has been in that office for 3 years, Wade said. "He came in as a junior clerk and Hargrove kept him because he was good with the filing system and didn't ask questions. Except Peters has been asking questions, quietly to himself for about 18 months. He poured coffee and pushed a cup across the desk to her. He kept his own record, dates, instrument numbers, property locations. Every transaction that felt wrong to him. He didn't know what he had, but he knew he had something, and he was scared to bring it to anyone because Hargrove had been commissioner for 7 years, and who would believe a junior clerk?" "Exactly." Wade sat down. "Peter's record goes back further than yours. He has instrument numbers for 8 additional properties, including 2 that transferred to Meridian before I even arrived in this county." He pushed a folded piece of paper across the desk. "That's his list." Clara unfolded it, read it, added the new instrument numbers to her notebook in the appropriate chronological order. When she looked up, Wade was watching her with the same direct attention he brought to everything, except this time there was something else in it she couldn't immediately categorize. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked away back to his own notes. "Peters also gave me a name, the man who set up the Harlan Creek Agricultural Lending Association as a legal entity, the name on the founding document." Clara went still. "And not Hargrove. Hargrove's not on the founding document at all." Wade turned his notepad so she could read it. "Aldous Crane, Denver Attorney incorporated the Lending Association in 1873, listed as managing partner." The name hit the center of everything she'd been building. "I found that name last night," Clara said quietly. "On a notary seal. Or rather, on a false one." She turned her notebook to the sketch she'd made of the Garrity payment demand seal. "My father had a case in Philadelphia 12 years ago, a fraudulent notary ring that used near-duplicate official seals to legitimize fabricated liens. The attorney at the center of it, he was disbarred and disappeared before they could bring criminal charges." She pointed to the sketch. "His name was Aldous Crane." The silence in the office was the particular kind that happens when 2 lines of evidence meet. Wade leaned forward and looked at her sketch, then at his notepad, then back at her, and she watched him run the calculation through not just the case, but the implication. A man who had run the same scheme in Philadelphia 12 years ago, disappeared. Resurfaced in Colorado territory under the protection of a county official running the same operation again with a decade of experience, making it harder to detect. He got smarter, Wade said. He always was smart. That was why it took 3 years to build a case against him in Philadelphia, and he still walked before it closed. Clara's voice was level. He's been doing this long enough to know exactly how close to the line he can get. Which means if we're going to stop him, we need to be exact. Every instrument, every signature, every fraudulent seal documented in a chain so complete that there's no version of events in which this is coincidence or clerical error. How close are you? Close. Not there. She stood and went to the window, not because there was anything to see, but because she needed to move. I need the territorial incorporation records for both Meridian Properties and Summit Range Geological Survey. I need to know if Crane's name appears on either. I need to verify whether any railroad company has filed a right-of-way application for this corridor. And I need all of it in writing officially obtained, so that when we present this, it can't be challenged as hearsay or dismissed as the claims of a woman with a personal dispute. She turned. How fast can you get to Denver and back? Something shifted in his expression. You want me to go to Denver? I want the investigation to have official reach. You can request those records in person in 2 days' ride each way, bring them back yourself, and maintain full chain of custody. If you send a wire, Hargrove may have contacts who see the request before it's fulfilled. She met his eyes. And you know Denver better than a letter does. He was quiet for a moment. If I go to Denver, you're here alone, with whatever Hargrove decides to do in the time it takes me to get there and back. I'll be at the Garrity farm, and Henry Spears is still here. Henry is a good deputy, and a limited one. His voice was frank, not unkind. He'll do what I tell him, and nothing more. If the situation requires judgment, then I'll exercise mine. She picked up her pouch. Wade, I need those records. We can't close this without them. It was the first time she'd used his given name. She noticed it a half-second after it came out, and so did he. She could see it in the small pause before he answered. I'll leave tomorrow morning, he said. I should be back in 5 days 6 at the outside. He stood. In the meantime, I want you to do nothing that puts you in a direct confrontation with Hargrove. No more visits to the land office. No more conversations in the street. He paused. Stay at the Garrity's. Work from your notes. Talk to Ruth if you need to, but don't go anywhere alone. You're being careful. I'm being accurate. He held her gaze. You are the only person in this county who can read what you've found. I've said that before. I mean it more now than I did then. Clara looked at him for a moment. Thought about the way he'd said it not as a warning about her safety, but as a statement about the case and how little daylight there was between those two things when one person was the only instrument capable of doing what needed to be done. I'll stay at the Garrity's, she said. Good. He picked up his hat. I'm going to ride out to the McCaffrey property this afternoon and get her documentation before I leave. If you have specific questions you need answered from those instruments, write them down and I'll take the list. I'll have it for you by noon. He was at the door when she said, Wade. He stopped. She hadn't planned to say anything further, but something in the set of his shoulders, the way he stood with his hand on the doorframe, made her think of Peter's face yesterday, when he'd told her about the Prescott children, and Ruth's hands flat on the table over her husband's name in Clara's notes, and Thomas Garrity sitting down like a man who had stopped holding something up after 14 months. These families, she said. When this is done, the land that was transferred to Meridian, can they get it back? He turned. The look on his face was not the careful professional neutral she'd come to read like a document. It was something older than that, and more personal, and she understood without him saying anything that the question landed somewhere specific in him. If we can prove the transfers were made under duress from fraudulent instruments, he said, then the transfers are legally void. The land reverts. He paused. It won't be simple, but it can be done. Then it's worth doing right, Clara said. Yes, Wade said. It is. He left. She stood in the empty office for a moment with the morning light coming through the single window and thought about what her father had told her once when she was 16, and a case had taken 2 years and still ended badly. He'd sat across from her at his desk with his hands folded and said, "The law is a slow machine, Clara Jane, and it favors the patient. What we do is load it and aim it correctly. Then we wait for it to fire." She hadn't understood yet then that some cases never fire. That patience alone isn't enough when the machine can be redirected by the people who control it. That sometimes you load it and aim it, and someone with more money and more influence simply points it somewhere else. But this was not Philadelphia. And she was not 22 working in her father's shadow trying to convince men to listen to conclusions they'd already decided they didn't want to hear. She had 6 families, and a pattern, and a clerk's hidden record, and a sheriff who had opened a formal investigation and was riding to Denver to get what she needed. She had more than she'd ever had before. She wrote Wade's question list at the Garrity table and had it back to his office before noon. He took it without reading it in front of her, folded it into his coat pocket, and said simply, 6 days. Don't do anything I'd want to stop you from doing. I won't do anything you'd want to stop me from, Clara said. I can't make the same promise about Hargrove. Something crossed his face that was almost a different expression than the one he usually wore, something with a little more warmth in it and a little less calculation, and then he put his hat on and walked out to his horse. Clara watched him ride out of Harlan Creek heading south and turned back to the Garrity farm. She had 6 days. She intended to use every hour of them. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known standing in the empty street with her notebook under her arm and Wade Callahan's dust already settling on the south road, was that Hargrove had spent the previous evening sending a wire to Denver, and that the reply had come back before dawn, and that the man who had built this operation from a disbarment and a disappearance and 12 years of patience was not going to wait 6 days to move against the one person who could unravel it. The first sign came on the second day. Clara was at the Garrity table working through instrument numbers from Peter's list when Margaret came in from the yard and set a cup of coffee down with more force than the action required. Clara looked up. Man rode past the east gate twice this morning, Margaret said. Didn't stop, didn't wave, just looked. Did you recognize him? Never seen him before. That's the point. Margaret sat down across from her with the steady, unhurried manner of a woman who had lived long enough on a frontier farm to distinguish between things that required alarm and things that required attention. This, her expression said, required attention. Tom's watching the south road. We don't get strangers out here without a reason. Clara closed her notebook. How far is it to town? 4 miles. And Henry Spears, the deputy, he knows I'm here. Wade told him before he left. Henry rides past twice a day, morning and evening. He came by at dawn, didn't see anything unusual. Margaret looked at Clara with the particular directness of a woman who had decided to say something she'd been holding back. Miss Whitmore, whatever you're building against Hargrove, how close are you to finished? Close, Clara said, but not close enough. Then you need to move faster than you planned. Margaret stood. Because that man on the road this morning wasn't a stranger passing through. He was measuring the property. I've seen that look before, right before the surveyor came through 2 years ago. Clara was on her feet before Margaret finished the sentence. She spread every document on the table, her notes. Peter's list, the Garrity instruments, the Dodd papers, her original deed, and went through them again from the beginning, not looking for what she'd already found, but for what she hadn't asked yet. Her father had taught her that. When a case feels like it's moving against you, go back to the documents. The answer you need is always in what you haven't read carefully enough. She was on the 3rd page of Peters's instrument list when she found it. It was a recording date, a single entry filed 14 months ago that she had noted and passed over, because it appeared to be a routine easement transfer, the kind of administrative instrument that got filed dozens of times a year in a busy land office. But the property description in Peter's notes placed it on the north edge of the corridor. And the grantee on the easement, it was the Denver and Southwestern Railroad Company. Clara read it twice. Then she read it a third time very slowly, making sure she was reading what she thought she was reading. 14 months ago, Hargrove had recorded a railroad easement across a property he had already helped strip from its owner through a fabricated lien. The railroad company's name was on a county record, not hidden behind Meridian Properties or Summit Range Geological Survey. Right there in the public record in Peter's notes in instrument number 1, 847-C, filed on a Tuesday in August 14 months ago, when the land office was busy with end-of-summer homestead claims and nobody was looking at easements. They hadn't just been assembling the corridor. They had already started recording railroad access on the pieces they controlled, which meant the Denver and Southwestern Railroad Company had a name in a county record, which meant they were not a shadow. They were a legal entity with a filing that connected them directly to the fraud, which meant Wade didn't need to go to Denver to find the connection between Crane and the railroad. The connection was already here, in Harlan Creek, in instrument 1847-C. Clara needed that instrument, the original with its notary seal and its recording stamp and its chain of title notation, because when Wade came back with the Denver records, and she laid this alongside them, there would be nothing left to argue about. She needed to go to the land office. She sat with that for a moment and heard Wade's voice as clearly as if he were in the room. No more visits to the land office, no more conversations in the street. Don't do anything I'd want to stop you from doing. Then she thought about the man riding past the Garrity East Gate, about Hargrove's wire to Denver, about Aldous Crane, who had built this scheme once before and walked away before it caught him, who had 12 more years of experience, and was not the kind of man who left loose threads lying on a table for 6 days, while a woman with a property law background pulled at them. She thought about Thomas Garrity sitting down at this table like a man who had been holding something up for 14 months, about Ruth's steady hands over her husband's name, about Peters's face when he'd told her about the Prescott children. She picked up her notebook and walked out to find Thomas. He was at the barn working with the focused economical movements of a man who had spent a lifetime making every action count. He looked at her face and put down his tool. "I need to go into town," Clara said. "I need you to take me." Wade said, "I know what Wade said. There's an instrument in the land office that connects the railroad company directly to the fraud, and it's in the public record. If I can get a copy of that instrument today, we don't need to wait for Wade to come back from Denver." She looked at him straight. "And I don't think we have 6 days, Thomas." He looked at her for a long time, with the measuring expression she'd come to understand, meant he was deciding not whether she was right, but whether he was willing to be part of what came next. Then he picked up his coat from the fence post. "Margaret drives the wagon," he said. "She's steadier under pressure than I am, and she'll argue with me if I say otherwise." "I heard that," Margaret called from the house. They were in town before noon. Clara went to the land office alone. Thomas and Margaret waited with the wagon on the street, with the casual, unhurried posture of people who happened to be running errands. It was the best cover available, and they both knew it. Peters was at his desk. He looked up when Clara came in, and something in his face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds: relief, then fear, then a focused, effortful calm. Hargrove was not there. One other clerk sat at the far desk without looking up. "Instrument 1847-C, Clara said quietly, coming to Peter's window. "I need to examine it as part of my active dispute claim." Peters didn't reach for the filing cabinet immediately. He looked at the other clerk, then back at Clara, and said in an even professional voice, "Of course, Miss Whitmore. One moment." He went to the cabinet, found the folder, and brought it to the examination counter. Then he leaned slightly forward and said, barely above a murmur, "He had a visitor last night. Arrived on the evening stage from Denver. They were in this office until past midnight." Clara opened the folder and began reading. "What did the visitor look like?" "Heavy, well-dressed, silver watch chain." He didn't introduce himself to anyone. Peters straightened and resumed his normal voice as the other clerk shifted in his chair. "The instrument you want is on page 2 of that folder." Clara found it. She read it in full, then read it again, and felt the particular cold clarity of something that had been theory becoming fact. The Denver and Southwestern Railroad Company, grantee of a recorded easement across a property Hargrove had helped fraudulently acquire. The notary seal on this instrument was different from the false seals on the debt instruments. This one was genuine, because this was a document Hargrove intended to stand up in court when the railroad went public with the right-of-way. This was the document where he'd stopped being careful, because he'd thought no one would ever connect it to the rest. She copied the critical details into her notebook: instrument number, date, grantee name, property description, notary registration number. The notary registration number was the piece she needed most. It would be traceable to an individual at the territorial office. A real person who had certified a real document that connected a railroad company to land obtained by fraud. She was copying the last line when the door opened. Cornelius Hargrove walked in, and behind him, moving with the unhurried ease of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered, was a heavy-set man in a well-cut coat with a silver watch chain catching the light. He had the kind of face that had been handsome 30 years ago and had since settled into the particular authority of a man who had spent 3 decades being told yes. Aldous Crane looked at Clara Whitmore across the land office counter and smiled. "Miss Whitmore," Hargrove said. His voice had changed from the careful pleasantness of their first meeting. There was no warmth in the pleasantness now, just the shape of it. "I wasn't expecting you today. I'm exercising my right as a claimant to examine public instruments." Clara closed her notebook without hurrying. "I was just finishing." "Of course." Hargrove came to the counter. "Allow me to introduce a colleague from Denver, Mr. Aldous Crane, legal counsel for Meridian Properties." Crane extended his hand across the counter with the gesture of a man who had never once had a handshake refused. "Miss Whitmore, I've been hoping to meet you." Clara looked at the hand, then at his face. She did not take the hand. "Mr. Crane," she said, "are you still practicing law in Colorado Territory? I understood your admission to the Pennsylvania bar was revoked in 1866. The smile didn't disappear, but something behind it did. Something cold and recalculating moved in behind his eyes, and she felt it the way you feel a temperature drop immediately physically without question. "Disbarment in one state doesn't preclude practice in another," he said pleasantly, "particularly in a territory with developing bar standards." He put his unshaken hand in his coat pocket. "I'm told you've been raising some concerns about county land records." "I've been documenting discrepancies in notarized instruments." "Yes." He tilted his head slightly. "Miss Whitmore, I have the great deal of experience with property disputes. In my experience, the most efficient resolution for all parties is usually a direct settlement. Your aunt's property, for example, Meridian Properties, would be prepared to offer you a fair purchase price today in exchange for withdrawal of any pending claims." "My claim is not pending," Clara said. "It's filed with the sheriff's office as part of a formal investigation." The temperature behind Crane's eyes dropped another degree. "I'm sure Sheriff Callahan is a thorough man, though I understand he's currently out of town." A pause perfectly timed. "These investigations have a way of becoming quite complex, quite expensive, quite lengthy." He looked at the folder still on the counter between them. "Whereas a settlement is simple, clean, final." "I'm sure it is," Clara said. She picked up the folder and held it out to Peters, who took it without making eye contact with anyone. "Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to settle a fraudulent claim as though it were a legitimate one. It would set a poor precedent." She picked up her leather pouch. "Good day, Mr. Hargrove, Mr. Crane." She walked to the door. She was aware of every step, aware of both men watching her, aware that the distance between the counter and the door was perhaps 15 feet, and that she needed to cover it without her pace changing or her hands doing anything visible. She made it, pushed through the door into the heat of the street. Thomas had the wagon moving before she reached it. She climbed up without being asked, and he had them around the first corner before she spoke. "Drive normally," she said. "Don't rush. Margaret, look at the dry goods store as we pass it." Margaret turned her head toward the store. "The heavy man," she said quietly. "Silver watch chain. Aldous Crane. He's the architect of all of it." Clara kept her voice level and her hands still in her lap. "He came to offer me a settlement, which means he knows the investigation is open and he's trying to close it before Wade comes back." "Will he do more than offer?" Thomas asked. "I don't know yet." Clara thought about the coldness behind Crane's eyes when she'd named his disbarment, about the man on the road that morning, about the wire Hargrove had sent 2 nights ago, and the visitor who had arrived on the evening stage. He's been running this operation for at least 7 years in this county, and 12 years before that somewhere else. He's not a violent man. Violence creates the kind of attention that destroys what he builds. His tool is paperwork and time, and the assumption that nobody will look closely enough. She paused. "But I've been looking closely enough for 4 days, and he knows it." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" "I need to get a message to Wade. Today. Not through the wire office in town, because Hargrove may have a contact there." She looked at Thomas. "Is there another way to reach him on the Denver road?" Thomas thought. "Hendricks runs a relay station 20 miles south. Wade would have stopped there the first night. If he's making good time, he'd have pushed on by now, but Hendricks knows every rider on that road. He could get a message forward." "How fast can you get someone to Hendricks?" "I can be there in 3 hours if I ride hard." He said it simply, without drama, like a man itemizing a practical problem. "Tom," Margaret said. "I know." He didn't look at her. "But you heard what she said. If they move against her while Callahan is on the road, we've got nothing, and these families have nothing." He looked at Clara. "What do I tell him?" Clara tore a page from the back of her notebook and wrote quickly. Instrument 1, 847-C. Denver and Southwestern Railroad Company grantee. Easement recorded 14 months ago. Notary registration number 2241-T. Crane is here. Come back fast. She folded it twice and handed it to Thomas. "Tell him the case is complete enough to move, and tell him to trust that." Thomas took the note and looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it into his breast pocket against his chest, in the same instinctive place a man puts something he doesn't intend to lose. He looked at his wife. "Go back to the farm," he said. "Keep her there. Keep the doors." He swung down from the wagon and went to his horse at the rail saddled and ready. "Thomas." Clara leaned forward. "Be careful." He looked up at her with the expression of a man who had been careful for 14 months while his land was taken and had decided he was done being only that. "I'll be careful enough," he said, and rode south. Margaret took the reins and drove them back to the farm without speaking, which was a kind of communication in itself. When they got inside, she put a pot on the stove and checked the loading on the rifle above the door with the unhurried competence of a woman for whom that was simply a thing that needed doing. And then she sat down across from Clara and said, "Now what?" "Now I write everything up," Clara said. "Everything I have in full in sequence, with instrument numbers and evidence citations, dated and signed." She opened her notebook to the first clean page. "Because if something happens to me before Wade gets back, someone else needs to be able to read this." Margaret looked at her steadily. "You think something will happen to you?" "I think Crane offered me a settlement this morning and I refused it in front of 2 witnesses." Clara picked up her pen. "Men like Crane don't offer twice." She wrote for 4 hours. She wrote the way she had learned to write in her father's office, not for an audience that already believed her, but for the most skeptical reader imaginable, the one who would look for every weakness in the chain and needed to find none. Every instrument number, every discrepancy, every cross-reference between Peter's list and her own documentation, every connection between the false notary seals and the Crane disbarment case in Philadelphia, the corridor geometry, the railroad easement, Meridian Properties, Summit, Range, Geological Survey. She wrote it as a legal brief would be written clean and sequential and irrefutable, and when she finished, she had 11 pages in her smallest, most precise hand. She made a second copy, then a third. "Ruth," she said to Margaret. "I'll get the copies to her tonight," Margaret said. "She'll put one in the false bottom of the flour bin, and one with Pastor Hendricks at the church." She looked at the pages without touching them. "Harold would have liked you, Miss Whitmore." Clara looked at her. "He wasn't a complicated man," Margaret said quietly. "But he believed in fairness the way some men believe in God. Absolute and unquestioning. It was what made him easy to deceive." She smoothed her apron. "And what makes what you're doing matter?" Clara set her pen down. Outside, the afternoon was cooling toward evening, and the light through the window had gone from gold to the flat amber that came before dark. Henry Spears would ride past soon on his evening circuit. She would flag him down and give him the third copy of her brief to hold at the jail under lock. If anything happened in the night, it would be in 4 places by morning: her notebook, Ruth's flour bin, Pastor Hendricks' church, and the jail, and Crane would have to burn down half of Harlan Creek to stop it from being read. Let him try. She was still sitting at the table when she heard hooves on the road. Too fast for an evening patrol. Too purposeful for a passing rider. She was at the window before Margaret moved. 2 men she didn't recognize rode past the gate without stopping, heading toward the north road. They rode with the focused and curious posture of men who knew exactly where they were going and didn't need to look around to find it. Clara watched them until they were out of sight. Then she turned back to the table, picked up the 3 copies of her brief, and handed one to Margaret. "Get this to Ruth tonight," she said. "Now, before dark." Margaret took it without asking why the urgency had moved up. She understood urgency. She had been living adjacent to it for 14 months. Clara picked up her pen and began writing a 4th copy. Her hand was steady. It had been steady since the moment she'd sat down across from Cornelius Hargrove's desk and found the lean that didn't match. What she didn't know, sitting at the Garrity table in the amber evening light, was that Thomas had found Wade 12 miles north of the Hendricks relay station, already pushing the horse harder than the road warranted, already carrying the particular expression of a man who had been 4 days away from something he should have stayed closer to. Thomas handed him the note through the gap between their 2 horses without stopping. Wade read it once, his jaw set. He looked at the horizon, calculated the miles and the dark coming down, and put his heels to the horse. He rode through the dark. Wade Callahan had ridden hard roads in bad weather for most of his adult life, and he knew the difference between pushing a horse and destroying one. He pushed. He gave the animal every reasonable yard, and then asked for more, and the horse gave it, because horses in his experience understood urgency the same way good men did not, through explanation, but through the quality of the hands holding the reins. Thomas rode beside him for the first 6 miles, then fell back when his horse began to labor. Wade didn't slow. He called back without turning his head. "Get to Henry Spears. Tell him to stay at the Garrity farm until I arrive." Then the dark closed behind him, and he was alone on the south road with Clara's note folded in his breast pocket and 11 words running through his head like a repeating rifle. Instrument 1847-C. Crane is here. Come back fast. He'd known something was wrong before Thomas found him. Not in any way he could have justified to another person, nothing specific, nothing evidentiary, just the particular unease of a man who had learned at significant cost to listen to the part of his brain that noticed things before his conscious mind caught up. He'd been pushing north since mid-afternoon. When Thomas appeared on the road, the feeling had resolved into something cold and specific, and he'd read the note once, and that was enough. The railroad easement. Instrument 1847-C. She'd found what he'd gone to Denver to find in the county records he'd left her standing next to, and Crane was already in town, which meant the settlement offer had already been refused, which meant they were past the part of this where money was the weapon. He rode into Harlan Creek at midnight. The town was quiet in the way of places that had gone to sleep without knowing they needed to be awake. He went to the jail first. Henry Spears was not there, which meant Thomas's message had gotten through, which was the first thing that had gone right since he'd read that note. He unlocked the office, lit the lamp, and looked at the copy of Clara's brief that Henry had left on the desk under a paperweight, with a note that said in Henry's labored hand, "She made me read the whole thing. She's right about all of it." Wade read it standing up. 11 pages. He read every word with the focused, sequential attention he'd used as a Pinkerton when a case brief arrived and the operation was already moving. She had built it the way he would have built it. Better in places, because she understood the documents at a level he was still learning. The corridor, the false seals, Peter's chronology, the railroad easement connecting the Denver and Southwestern Railroad Company directly to the fraudulent acquisitions, Crane's disbarment in Philadelphia, and the matching seal methodology, Meridian Properties as the acquisition vehicle, Summit Range, Geological Survey as the right-of-way mapping tool. It was complete. Not almost complete. Complete. Every element connected to every other element in a chain that had no gap, no assumption, no place where a defense attorney could stand up and say, "This could be coincidence," or "This rests on the word of a woman with a personal dispute." She had built it so that it rested on nothing except the documents themselves, and the documents did not lie. He was out the door in 4 minutes with the brief in his coat and Henry's horse, which was fresher than his own, saddled at the rail. The Garrity farm was dark except for one lamp in the front window. Wade recognized the lamp as a signal, not accident, not someone forgetting to blow it out, but a lamp placed deliberately where a rider on the road would see it. He was off the horse before it fully stopped. Henry opened the door. His face had the particular tight-wound look of a young man trying to appear more certain than he felt. "She's all right," he said immediately. "Nothing happened tonight, but earlier. I'll hear it from her." Wade stepped past him. Clara was at the table. She had her notebook open and a cup of cold coffee at her elbow, and she was writing, which did not surprise him. She looked up when he came in, and something moved across her face. Relief quickly contained, replaced by the same composed focus she'd worn since the first morning she'd walked into his office. But he'd seen the relief. He filed it away in the same place he'd been filing other things about her since approximately the second day. "You made good time," she said. "You found the railroad easement." He sat down across from her without being invited. Margaret Garrity appeared from the back room, looked at both of them, and went back without speaking. "Tell me what happened today." She told him. All of it. Crane's arrival. The settlement offer the 2 riders on the North Road at dusk, the 4 copies of the brief distributed across the county. She told it the way she wrote sequentially and without editorializing, and he listened the way he'd trained himself to listen without interrupting building the picture. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The 2 riders heading north. Henry reported them." "Henry didn't see them, I did." "Where were they going on the North Road?" "I don't know. That's what concerns me." She turned her notebook to a rough sketch. Not her corridor map, a different one. A property map. The North Road passes 3 of the 6 affected properties, including Ruth Dodd's laundry and the McCaffrey homestead. She looked at him. "If Crane decides the best way to stop this case is to destroy the documentation held by the families involved..." Wade stood. "Henry." He raised his voice toward the door. Henry appeared. "Sir, I need you to ride to Ruth Dodd's place right now, not in the morning, now. You tell her to take everything from the flour bin and the pastor and bring it to the jail and lock it in the evidence cabinet. You stay with her until she's done, and then you come back here." He paused. "If anyone tries to stop you or her, you make as much noise as possible, and you don't worry about what comes after." Henry had his hat on before Wade finished the sentence. The door closed behind him, and the sound of hooves faded north. Clara was looking at Wade with the particular expression she had when she was recalculating something. "You think they'll move against the documentation?" "I think Crane offered you a settlement this morning and you refused it in front of witnesses, and he's been building this operation for 7 years in this county, and he didn't get this far by waiting to see what happened. Wade sat back down. He's going to try to take the evidence apart before morning. The distributed copies were the right call, I want you to know that. But I went to Denver for a reason, and I came back with it. He reached into his coat and put 3 folded documents on the table between them. Territorial Incorporation Records. Summit Range Geological Survey, filed 1874, Primary Officer Aldous Crane. Meridian Properties, filed 1871, Primary Officer Aldous Crane. And he tapped the 3rd document, Denver and Southwestern Railroad Company right-of-way application, filed 6 months ago with the Territorial Land Office. The designated corridor runs through Larimer County on a line that I have now confirmed matches your sketch to within 400 yards. He met her eyes. The application was filed by legal counsel. The attorney of record for the Denver and Southwestern Railroad Company is Aldous Crane. The kitchen went still. Clara picked up the right-of-way application and read it. Twice. She set it down and picked up the Meridian Properties Incorporation and read that. She was very quiet, the way a person is quiet when they are not resting, but processing, when the last piece of something large settles into place and the full shape of it becomes visible for the first time. He's all 3, she said. He built the survey company to map the corridor, the lending association to generate the false debt instruments, the holding company to receive the fraudulent transfers, and he's the legal counsel for the railroad that benefits from all of it. She looked up. He's not just Hargrove's employer, he's the entire apparatus. From a disbarment in Pennsylvania to a right-of-way worth $500,000 in Colorado territory, Wade said. 12 years. And he almost got away with it. Clara's voice was quiet, not with awe, but with the precise, unsentimental recognition of someone who understood how close the margins had been. If my aunt hadn't left me that specific parcel, if I hadn't happened to have the original deed with me, if I'd accepted the settlement this morning. She paused. If you hadn't opened the investigation, you'd have found another way. Maybe. She looked at him, but not fast enough. Wade looked back at her and thought about what he wanted to say, which was more than was warranted by the situation, and less than he'd been thinking since approximately the 3rd day he'd known her. He settled on the practical version. With your brief and these 3 documents, we have enough to arrest Hargrove tonight and wire the territorial marshal for Crane. He kept his voice even. The case is complete. You built it complete. In 4 days. We built it, Clara said. The correction was matter-of-fact, not generous. She said it the way she said things that were true. Something in his chest did a thing he didn't examine. I need you to be present for the arrest. Hargrove will claim the instruments have been misread, and you're the only person in this county who can demonstrate in real time that they haven't. Can you do that tonight? Yes. They rode into town at 2 in the morning. Clara on Margaret's mare, Wade on Henry's horse. The main street was empty. The land office was dark. Hargrove's house was on the east side of town, a proper frame house with a porch, the kind of house a man built when he intended to stay somewhere long enough to be trusted. Wade knocked. 3 times evenly spaced the knock of an official who was not angry and not uncertain. It took 4 minutes. Then a lamp came on inside, and Cornelius Hargrove opened the door in his robe with the face of a man who had been awake for hours, and was not surprised by the knock, only by how soon it had come. He looked at Wade. He looked at Clara. He looked at the documents in Clara's hand. Something that might have been calculation moved behind his eyes, and then something else. Something that had no name except the look of a man who has been running for a long time and has just understood the distance has run out. Mr. Hargrove, Wade said, you're under arrest for fraud, falsification of public records, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their property rights under territorial law. I'd ask you to get dressed. Hargrove looked at Clara one more time. She looked back at him with the same steady, impersonal focus she'd brought to his desk 4 days ago when she'd put 2 documents side by side and asked him to read the lien entry out loud. He'd had the advantage then, the 7 years, the machinery, the comfortable certainty that no one would look closely enough. He didn't have it now. "I'd like to speak to my attorney," he said. "You can do that from the jail," Wade said. He dressed. He came out, and Wade put the cuffs on him with the efficient, neutral manner of a man who had done this many times and found no satisfaction in it, only the solid completion of a necessary thing. They walked him down the main street of Harlan Creek in the 2 o'clock dark and put him in the cell at the end of the jail, and Wade locked it and hung the key and sat down at his desk. Clara sat across from him and put her brief and the 3 Denver documents and the Garrity papers and the Dodd papers in a single ordered stack on the desk between them. She was very still. "Crane," she said. "Wire goes to the territorial marshal at first light. I'll have a response by afternoon." He paused. "Crane is in Denver. He'll hear about Hargrove before noon and he'll run." "He's run before," Clara said. "From Philadelphia, which is why he's been doing this in Colorado territory for 12 years. She looked at the stack of documents. "But he ran from Philadelphia because the case wasn't complete before he left. Because I was 22 and working in my father's shadow and couldn't make anyone listen fast enough." Her voice was even. "This case is complete. The territorial marshal will have everything he needs to extradite if Crane crosses a state line. He's not going to be able to disappear into another territory and start over. Not from this." Wade looked at her for a long moment. She was sitting across from him in a chair in the middle of the night in a jail that smelled of dust and old paper, with the evidence that had taken them 4 days to build stacked on the desk between them. And she was talking about a man she'd been chasing in one form or another for 12 years, with the quiet certainty of someone who had finally aimed the machine correctly and was waiting for it to fire. "You said your father had a case against Crane in Philadelphia," Wade said. "He never closed it. He died before he could." Clara's hands were still on the desk. "He spent 2 years building it, and Crane walked before the indictment was filed. My father kept the case notes in a box in his office, and I read them so many times I have them memorized." She paused. "He would have been glad to know the notary seal gave it away. He always said Crane's weakness was vanity. He made his false instruments too good, too consistent, and consistency was the thing that would eventually make the pattern visible." She looked at Wade. He was right. Wade said nothing for a moment. Then, "He taught you well?" "He taught me everything." Her voice was simple without performance. "And then he was gone, and I spent 10 years trying to do his work in a world that wouldn't put my name on the filing." She looked at the stack of documents. "This is the first case where the filing will have my name on it." He understood then what this was for her. Not just the land, not just the 6 families, not just the 12 years of Crane building and running and building again. It was the thing her father hadn't been able to finish completed by the person he'd spent a lifetime training in a territorial jail at 2 in the morning with a stack of irrefutable documents and a sheriff who had learned in 4 days to trust her judgment more than any attorney he'd worked with in his career. "It'll have your name on it," he said. "Every page." The territorial marshal's wire arrived at 2:30 the following afternoon. Crane had been located at his Denver office, where he had apparently spent the morning in a meeting with Denver and Southwestern Railroad executives. He had not run. Wade read the wire twice and understood Crane had been confident enough in the operation's invisibility to believe that Hargrove's arrest was a local problem, containable, not the exposed end of a complete chain that ran from Philadelphia to Larimer County to a right-of-way application with his name on the attorney line. He'd underestimated the documentation. He had spent 12 years successfully because nobody had ever documented it completely before. This time, someone had. The marshal's deputies arrested Aldous Crane in his Denver office at noon. He was sitting at his desk with the Summit Range Geological Survey maps spread open in front of him, and he looked up at the deputies with the expression of a man finally understanding the exact nature of his miscalculation. Clara was at the jail when the second wire came in confirming the arrest. She read it standing at Wade's desk and set it down and was quiet for a long moment. Not with relief. Something deeper than relief. The kind of stillness that comes after a very long effort reaches its completion, and the body takes a moment to remember that the effort is over. "It's done," she said. "It's done." Wade confirmed. She sat down. He poured 2 cups of coffee and pushed one across to her without asking, and she took it the way she always took things he offered without ceremony, as though it were natural, as though they had been doing this for years instead of days. He had noticed sometime around the 3rd day that the space between them had stopped feeling like the space between a sheriff and a witness, and had started feeling like something that had its own gravity. He had not said anything about it because the timing had been consistently wrong, and he was by temperament and by hard experience a man who did not move on incomplete information. The timing was less wrong now. "What happens to the land?" Clara asked. She was looking at her coffee. "Hargrove's arrest triggers an automatic review of all instruments recorded during his tenure. The fraudulent transfers are legally void. The land reverts to the original owners." He paused. "It'll take months to process through the territorial court, but it comes back." She nodded. She was thinking about the Garrity's he could tell, about Ruth's steady hands, about Peters at his desk with his hidden record and his fear and his one moment of courage in the street, about the Prescott children. Thomas had mentioned 4 of them, and the family that had sold their land at a quarter value and left the county before anyone knew to help them. "The Prescotts," she said. "They sold under coercion from a fraudulent instrument. The sale price will be addressed as part of the restitution claim. Crane's assets in Colorado Territory are considerable. The properties he holds through Meridian are worth more than enough to compensate everyone at full market value." Wade set his cup down. "Your brief was specific about that. The territorial court will use it." She looked at him. "You read all 11 pages?" "Twice. Once last night and once this morning while you were at the Garrity's." He held her gaze. "You wrote it so that even a man who isn't a property attorney could follow it step by step without missing anything." He paused. "That's not an accident." "No," Clara said. "It isn't." She had written it for the widest possible reader. For Henry Spears, who had done everything right with limited tools. For Thomas Garrity, who deserved to understand what had been taken from him and exactly how it was being returned. For the territorial court, which would need to apply it without her standing there to explain. And for Wade, she could admit now, because she had written it while he was on the road, and had not known for certain he would make it back in time, and she had needed someone else to be able to finish it if she couldn't. "I have to go back to Philadelphia," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Wade was still. "When?" "Not immediately. The territorial court will need my testimony, and I should be here for the property reviews to make sure the instruments are read correctly." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "A month, maybe 6 weeks." And then, she looked at him. He was looking back at her with the same direct, undeflected attention he brought to everything except that right now there was nothing professional in it. Just the look of a man asking a question he hadn't put into words yet. "I don't have anything to go back to," she said honestly. "A rented room and a city that spent 10 years finding new ways to tell me I couldn't sign my own name to my own work." She paused. "The territorial bar has been admitting women since 1876. I looked it up before I left Philadelphia." Another pause. "I looked it up before I bought my stage ticket." Wade set his cup down on the desk with the careful, deliberate movement of a man making sure his hands had something to do. "You looked up Colorado bar admission before you came here." "I looked up a great many things before I came here." She met his eyes. "I came for my aunt's land." That was true. "But I also came because a woman with 10 years of property law and no bar admission in Pennsylvania had some decisions to make about where she intended to practice." The jail was very quiet. Hargrove was in the cell at the end of the corridor and would be transferred to the territorial facility in the morning, and after that, this office would go back to being a small-town sheriff's department in Larimer County, with 1 deputy and a competent, careful man at the desk who had come here to atone for a mistake he had not made in a long time. "I could use a property attorney," Wade said. "This county is going to have a significant volume of instrument reviews in the next several months, and the nearest bar-admitted attorney is in Fort Collins." Clara looked at him for a long moment. At the careful, practical framing of it. At the way he'd said it without looking away. At the 11 pages of her brief still stacked on the desk between them, both their names on the investigation record, the case built by two people who had learned in 4 days to function as though they'd been working together for years. "That would be a professional arrangement," she said. "To start with," Wade said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll need office space. The land office is going to have a vacancy in the position of county land commissioner. The commissioner's office is a reasonable size. I expect the county will be looking to fill that position with some urgency." He paused. "I'd be willing to recommend a candidate with relevant experience." The corner of Clara's mouth moved. It was the first time in 4 days he had seen anything close to a smile on her face, and it landed somewhere in his chest with the weight of something he understood he would not be forgetting. "Then I'll stay," she said. She said it simply the way she said everything true, without asking for acknowledgement, without waiting to see if it would be taken back. The same way she had walked into his office on the first morning with a sketch and 4 pages of notes, and stated what she'd found and what she needed, and had not flinched when he'd made her prove it. Outside, Harlan Creek was waking up to a morning that would carry the news from one end of the county to the other before noon. Ruth Dodd would hear it at the laundry. Thomas and Margaret Garrity would hear it on the North Road. Peters would hear it at whatever desk he was sitting at, now that the office he'd spent 3 years in was under investigation. The Prescotts, wherever they'd gone, would eventually hear it too. 6 families, 1 corridor, a false lending association, and a disbarred attorney and a county official who had spent 7 years believing that the most effective crime was the one built in language nobody else could read. Nobody. That is, until a woman arrived on a stagecoach with a dead woman's deed and her father's training, and the particular patient fury of someone who had been told for 10 years that she wasn't allowed to sign her own name to her own work. Clara Whitmore picked up her notebook, put her pen in her coat pocket, and walked out of the Harlan Creek jailhouse into the morning sun of Larimer County, Colorado Territory, where her name was on the filing, and the land was going back to the people it belonged to, and some things once set right by the right hands did not come undone again.